The Long March of Everyman. Themes and variations from the history of the people in Britain. Program 1, Green Land, Red Bricks. Britons and Romans and Beginnings. Composed and produced by Michael Mason under the direction of Barry Cunliffe, Professor of Archaeology at the University of Southampton.
For my friends, in mind of all common and hidden men, and of the secret princes.
In my beginning is my end. In succession, houses rise and fall, crumble, are extended, are removed, destroyed, restored, or in their place is an open field, or a factory, or a bypass. Old stone to new building, old timber to new fires, old fires to ashes, and ashes to the earth, which is already flesh, fur and feces, bone of man and beast, corn stalk and leaf.
However violent the contortion or whatever the inversion of the folding, oblique through the fire-wrought cold rock diked from convulsions under, through the slow sedimentations laid by his patient creature of water.
Britain is a very small place. On a fine day, flying in a jet, you can see virtually the whole of it in 3 hours. You sweep in over Land's End, and you see there the intricate edge of the land outlined by the white surf. Very quickly you pass over the 4 big granite domes of the southwest, the Land's End granite, St. Austell, Bodmin and Dartmoor.
The people who live by the promontory of Britain, called Cornwall, are remarkably friendly and through intercourse with foreign traders are fairly civilized. They prepare tin, skillfully work in the ground which produces it. They hammer the metal into ingots.
You leave the land over the estuary, you skim across Lyme Bay, and then you're back to land over that queer pebbly arc of the Chesil Bank. The Isle of Purbeck, Poole Harbour, and you cut across the diamond shape of the Isle of Wight, and then there are 3 more extraordinary inlets, Portsmouth Harbour, Chichester Harbour and Langston Harbour, interlocked like bits of a jigsaw puzzle. And then the unmistakable form of the chalk, till you reach Cuckmere Haven, and then the Seven Sisters, the chalk beautifully cut through in cross-sections to show its undulations.
Caesar's view of Britain was geared entirely to dolling up Britain, to throw his own very minimal exploits into high relief.
The island is triangular, with one side facing Gaul. One corner of this side, on the coast of Kent, is the landing place for nearly all the ships from Gaul, and points east. The lower corner points south. The length of this side is about 475 miles.
The mountains, by various kinds of pressure, get rocked up. As soon as this has happened, you get the opposite process of the wearing down. The rain and the wind, a kind of invisible sculptor, always changing the surface of the land.
Then you turn north, and almost at once you're seeing the tentacles of London. Then the huge amorphous mass of London, then the tentacles are reaching out to the north, trying to grasp, it would seem, the whirls and spirals that are the new towns and houses of Welwyn, Hatfield and Harlow.
The greatest part of the island is level and wooded, but there are many hilly tracts.
It produces corn, cattle, gold, silver, and iron. All these are exported, together with hides, slaves, and dogs useful for hunting.
This endless process, over thousands of millions of years, shaped a Britain with two quite contrasting natures. To the south and the east, there are the lowlands, young, soft, extroverted, and always very easily accessible. It's easiest to live there.
And then you're on the plain, flat side of England. Cambridge, possibly you see, Peterborough. Lincoln you can identify positively because of the cathedral. And then there's the Humber, shining out to Spurn Head, the Wolds, the North York Moors, the gash of the Tyne between Gateshead and Newcastle.
All our easting waters are confluent with the Farthing River and tributary to him. Tamesis, Great Ouse, Tyne from the Wall's End, demarking Tweed, Forth that winds the Middlemarch, Tummel, and wide-looping Tay that laps the wading files when Burnham bows deploy towards Dunsinane, out towards the Goat Flats.
Then, in the north and the west, there are the highlands, which are built of the ancient hard rock. Very hard, introverted, and relatively inaccessible. Atlantic winds come in and tend to wrap them in driving rain and mist, the Celtic mist. Not very many people live among the higher mountains.
Then there's a rocky coast with a fret-sawn edge. And then you're over the Firth of Forth. Then it's wild country for a quarter of an hour over the Cairngorms, the Moray Firth to Caithness, and you can see John O'Groats leaning out to the east. But you swing west to that extraordinarily named bluff headland, the Cape Wrath.
Tacitus was trying to show Britons rather as the noble savage.
Britain is the largest of the islands known to us Romans. Its northern shores, with no land confronting them, are beaten by a wild and open sea. The general shape of Britain has been compared to an elongated diamond or a double-headed axe. Such, indeed, is its shape south of Caledonia.
You turn south over Sutherland, Ross and Cromarty, and you come down that marvellously indented coast with names that couldn't fail to stir your heart. Marie and Torridon, Scalpay, the sound of Sleat and Tobermory, the sound of Mull and the Linney Loch.
But when you go farther north, you find a huge and shapeless tract of country, jutting out toward the Land's End and finally tapering into a kind of wedge. This coast of that remotest sea was first rounded by a Roman fleet, which thus established the fact that Britain was an island.
And Inverary and Ben Lomond, and then you're over the huge mass of Glasgow. You pass the braided tidal channels of the Solway Firth, then it's the Lake District with all those well-known waters spread out. You clip Morecambe Bay, there's a square-headed peninsula of the Wirral between the Dee and the Mersey, and to the east you can see the smudge of Liverpool reaching right out to Manchester and curving round in the great crescent of the industrial heartland, reaching right round to Birmingham. Your course lies down over the Welsh marches until you come to the crinkly north-south lines that are the Welsh valleys, and they debouch into the Vale of Glamorgan. 2.5 minutes to cross the Bristol Channel, giving you barely time to search out Flatholme and Steepholme. The Quantock Hills, the dune country of Exmoor, and you're back over the four great domes in reverse order. Dartmoor, Bodmin, St Austell and Land's End, and then it fades away into the distance, and you've covered the whole thing in, say, 3 hours, 1,600 miles at most. It's small enough to be comprehensible. It's small enough for one man to get a good grasp of in the course of a lifetime.
The whole island is 1,900 miles in circumference.
The overall impression you have of Britain looking down from a great height is of open country. There seems to be an enormous mud to it. You have to search out the towns. Even so, down there, in those blue-green depths, there are 55 million people.
In Neolithic and Iron Age times, the densest populations in this country were on the uplands and chalk ridges of the south, on Salisbury Plain, on Cotswolds, and further north on the Yorkshire Wolds and the Derbyshire limestone uplands, because the primitive tools were not sufficient to clear or drain the richer soils in the valleys.
The climate is objectionable, with its frequent rains and mists, but there is no extreme cold.
And this also has been one of the dark places of the earth. Imagine the feelings of a commander of a fine, what do you call them, trireme in the Mediterranean, ordered suddenly to the north, run overland across the Gauls in a hurry, put in charge of one of these craft the legionaries, a wonderful lot of handy men they must have been too, used to build, apparently by the hundred, in a month or two, if we may believe what we read. Imagine him here, the very end of the world, a sea the colour of lead, a sky the colour of smoke, a kind of ship about as rigid as a concertina, and going up this river with stores or orders or what you like.
Claudius found himself in command of an expeditionary force bound for Britain, but he had trouble in inducing his troops to cross the channel. The soldiers objected to campaigning outside what they regarded as the limits of the known world.
Men coming from these remote regions told strange stories of hurricanes, unknown birds, sea monsters, and shapes half human and half animal, which they had seen or in their terror had imagined.
Down there, in those blue-green depths, there are 55 million people.
A Neolithic axe has been used to cut down a pine tree with a diameter of 7 inches in 8 minutes.
Who the first inhabitants of Britain were remains obscure. One must remember, we are dealing with barbarians.
The men are taller than the Gauls, and their hair is not so yellow. They are more loosely made. At Rome, we saw certain British youths who were half a foot taller than the tallest there, but they were bandy-legged and rather clumsily built in general.
The average Iron Age farm, I think, would have been a very smelly place. All these pits with kitchen refuse close by the farm.
The soil can bear all produce except the olive, the vine, and other natives of warmer climates. And it is fertile. Crops are slow to ripen, but quick to grow. Both facts are due to one and the same cause, the extreme moistness of land and sky. Britain yields gold, silver, and other metals to make it worth conquering.
Britain, because it was a very rich land, produced a large population, an area of countryside dotted with little farms. Gradually, man came together in larger groups. The old Neolithic hill forts, these were gradually transformed into semi-urban centres. There were streets, there were little round houses all the way along the streets, and the growth of an aristocracy, the protector, the war leader, throughout the 500 years or so before the Romans came.
Look and see where they're prepared to shift most stone and soil. That is where a people's heart really lies. In the Bronze Age, they did it for temples and for tombs for the dead. When the Celts came, they did it for warfare.
In Britain, there are thousands of hill forts. It was very difficult for all these little demi-kings to come together and to oppose Rome.
In the 4th, 3rd centuries BC, the Celtic Empire was enormous.
By far the most civilized inhabitants are those living in Kent, a purely maritime district. Most of the tribes in the interior do not grow corn, but live on milk and meat and wear skins. All the Britons dye their bodies with woad, which produces a blue color, and this gives them a more terrifying appearance in battle. They wear their hair long and shave the whole of their bodies except the head and the upper lip. Wives are shared between groups of 10 or 12 men, especially between fathers and sons.
One Roman writer says that the Celts were war mad.
Britain yields gold, silver, and other metals to make it worth conquering. The Britons lined the shore in a dense, armed mass. Among them were black-robed women with disheveled hair, like furies, brandishing torches. Close by stood druids, raising their hands to heaven and screaming dreadful curses.
They would work themselves up into a terrible rage, making a terrible noise with their chariots and shouting war cries and so on. This was a regular state of affairs, and one that I think the Romans found rather trying until they got used to it.
This weird spectacle awed the Roman soldiers into a sort of paralysis. They stood still and presented themselves as targets. But then the Romans urged each other, and were urged by the general, not to fear a horde of fanatical women.
Jump for it! Jump for it, you bastards! If you don't want them to capture our eagle!
Onward pressed their standards, and they bore down their foes. Once they owed obedience to kings, now they are distracted between the jarring factions of rival chiefs. Indeed, nothing has helped us Romans more than their inability to cooperate. Fighting in detail, they are conquered wholesale.
The Celts made their round houses rather as a bird builds its nest. They made their tracks and their field walls curving in and out with the hill and the valley. And of course the Celts liked curves anyhow. All the designs that they put on their pots, on their weapons, they were all curvilinear with a wonderful free flow of plant forms.
539 years since the first consular year and the beginnings of the less uncertain sequences and the more defined contours. How long since first we began to contrive on the loose-grained tufas quarried about the place? In size, spaced and clear on the carried marbles, impose on the emblems Senatus Populusque.
The Senate and people of Rome.
Senatus Populusque Romanus.
These serried ranks of legionaries and auxiliaries, all with the same sort of armour, all marching in meticulous order. The contrast, the order, the uniformity, with the Celtic brazen individuality would have been staggering.
To induce a people hitherto scattered, uncivilized, and therefore prone to fight, to grow pleasurably broken into peace and ease, Agricola gave private encouragement and official assistance to the building of temples, public squares, and private mansions.
The Romans imposed an intellectual pattern on what had been the spontaneous, unthought-out pattern of prehistoric and Celtic life. They drove their roads as straight as thought.
The route from Londinio to Lugavalio on the wall. Londinio to Caesaramago, 28,000 paces. Caesaramago to Colonia, 24,000 paces. Colonia to Villa Faustini, 35,000 paces.
The houses were built with plumb line and set square, and they were red, they were square, and they stood out against this rolling, curving substance of the prehistoric world.
Bricks should be made in spring or autumn. so that they may dry uniformly. Those made in summer are defective because the fierce heat of the sun bakes the surface and makes the bricks seem dry while inside it is not dry. Bricks will be most serviceable if made 2 years before using, for they cannot dry thoroughly in less time.
S, P, Q, R.
Central heating, underfloor central heating, rather on the basis of night storage heating now. They might have hired the local mosaicist. He would bring out his pattern book. They would flick through it like a book of wallpapers, and the owner would say, well, I like that pattern, but I don't much like that picture. Can't you put me a seahorse there instead of a Medusa? And so the mosaicist would come along and lay the floor more or less to order, but along the lines of the pattern book. Their building was now the status symbol.
Furthermore, Agricola trained the sons of the chiefs in the liberal arts. The result was that in place of distaste for the Latin language, it became a passion to command it. Our national dress came into favor, and the toga was everywhere to be seen.
S, P, Q, R.
The Britons submit themselves to the levy, the tribute, and the other charges of empire with cheerful readiness, provided that there is no abuse. That they bitterly resent, for they are broken into obedience, not to slavery.
But to a farmer living in the wilds of the South Downs, in an Iron Age hut, there would have been no dramatic change at all.
S, P, Q, R. Villa Faustini to Icenos, 18,000 paces. Icenos to Camborico, 35,000 paces. Camborico to Dura-Leponte, 35,000 paces. Dura-Leponte to Dura-Brivas, 35,000 paces. Dura-Brivas.
The Roman world had expanded as far as it need, and Hadrian decided to draw the line in Britain with Hadrian's Wall. It was a Roman attempt to be formal and rigid, where really a fluid, more resilient boundary was required.
We don't know the ins and outs. How should we? How could we? It's not for the likes of you and me to cogitate high policy or to guess the inscrutable economy of the pontifex from the circuit of the Agger, from the traverse of the wall. But you see a thing or two in our walk of life, walking the compass of the Walham, walking for 20 years of nights, round and back and fro on the walls that contain the world. You see a thing or two, you think a thing or two in our walk of life, walking for 20 years by day, by night, doing the rounds of the walls that maintain the world.
And so the Britons were gradually led on to the amenities that make vice agreeable. Arcades, baths, and sumptuous banquets.
The rooms for the hot and tepid baths should be lighted from the southwest, or, if the nature of the situation prevents this, at all events, from the south, because the set time for bathing is principally from midday to evening.
They spoke of such novelties as civilization, when really they were only a feature of enslavement.
One of the main troubles with the Celts all along has been their total disorganization, and this is why the Romans found them, I think, so easy to control, because they could cash in, as it were, on this great impulsiveness and lack of forethought with their own calculated strategy, and outwit them in this way.
Certain states were presented to King Cogidubnus, who maintained his unswerving loyalty down to our own times. An example of the long-established Roman custom of employing even kings to make others slaves.
Cogidubnus came over to the side of Rome, and he made a bomb out of it. Others, like Caratacus, opposed Rome. Cogidubnus seeing the future and cashing in on it, Caratacus living in the Celtic past and failing.
To Neptune and Minerva, for the welfare of the divine house, by the authority of Tiberius Claudius Hogedobnus, king, imperial legate in Britain. The guild of smiths and those therein gave this temple from their own resources, the son of Pundentinus presenting this site.
The Druids officiate at the worship of the gods, regulate public and private sacrifices, and give rulings on all religious questions. They are held in great honor by the people.
The Romans were very good psychologists, really, and once they had overcome the people, they allowed them to go on worshipping their own deities. They would equate a native god with one of the classical gods. They would no doubt say, well, such and such a god, like Androscoccus, for example, at Colchester, he's obviously very much like Mercury, and so he would be invoked as Mercurius Androscoccus.
To the god Nodens, Silvianus has lost his ring and given half its value to Nodens. Among those who are called Senicianus do not allow help until he brings it to the temple of Nodens.
In place of distaste for the Latin language came a passion to command it. And so the Britons were gradually led on to the amenities that make vice agreeable.
We shall continue to march round and round the cornucopia. That's the new fatigue.
I suppose the Britons didn't know what was happening. It's the pattern of a highly civilized, very sophisticated, politically aware capitalist society taking over a more barbarous people not used to this type of sophistication.
Round and round the cornucopia.
Londinium, crowded with merchants and provisions.
See that you turn the slave girl into cash.
The organization of Roman economy was a thing very much to be welcomed because they made more money and they were able to add to their own wealth, their own status through Rome. Some leaders definitely said, well, Rome is for me. I'm going to throw in my lot with the invaders. They'd had enough of the turmoil, of the fragmentation of what had gone before. The Romans invaded in 43. By 60, we've got our first major resistance movement.
The person who was mainly responsible for rousing the natives and persuading them to fight the Romans, and who directed the conduct of the entire war, was Boudica, a Breton woman of the royal family and more intelligent than most women. She was very tall and terrifying, with a fierce glare and a harsh voice. A great mane of tawny hair hung down to her hips. Round her neck was a large golden necklace. She wore a tunic of many colors, and over this was a thick mantle fastened with a brooch.
Boudica drove round in a chariot, her daughters with her. As they reached each tribal contingent, she proclaimed that the Britons were well used to the leadership of women in battle, but she did not come among them now as a descendant of mighty ancestors, eager to avenge her lost wealth and kingdom. Rather was she an ordinary woman fighting for her lost freedom, her bruised body, and the outraged virginity of her daughters.
Here was Boudica, the queen, taking over a noble family on the death of her husband. And what happened, really, was that the king wanted his enormous fortune to pass to his family. So he simply made a will, leaving half of it to the emperor and half of it to his wife.
In chariot fighting, the Britons begin by driving all over the field, hurling javelins. And generally the terror inspired by the horses and the noise of the wheels is sufficient to throw their opponents' ranks into disorder. They can run along the chariot pole, stand on the yoke, and get back into the chariot as quick as lightning. At first, the legion stood its ground. When the enemy approached, they discharged their javelins. Then they burst forward in wedge formation. And the cavalry broke down all serious resistance. The rest of the Britons turned to flight. The Romans did not spare the women. It was a glorious victory, equal to those of the good old days. Some estimate as many as 80,000 British dead.
It seems highly unlikely this would mean a mortality in 24 hours of about 200 per thousand, 20%.
Boudica ended her life with poison.
To the spirits of the departed, and to Regina, his freed woman and wife, a Cascellonian by tribe, age 30, Paredes of Palmyra, set this up.
To the spirits of the departed, Paredes of Palmyra, the flag bearer, lived 68 years.
And so the Britons were gradually led on to the amenities that make vice agreeable.
Those who do business in country produce must have stalls and shops in their entrance courts, and with crypts, granaries, storerooms, and so forth in their houses, constructed more for the purpose of keeping the produce in good condition than for ornamental beauty. For capitalists and farmers of the revenue, comfortable and showy apartments must be constructed, secure against robbery. For advocates and public speakers, handsome and more roomy to accommodate meetings. For men of rank, libraries, picture galleries, and basilicas finished in a style similar to that of great public buildings, since public councils, as well as private lawsuits and hearings before arbitrators, are very often held in the houses of such men.
In Roman Britain, London was by far the biggest town, probably 10 to 15,000 inhabitants, and probably the only town that could be called viable from an economic point of view. The rest were towns of 1,000, 1,500 people at most. They were strategic bases, either militarily or politically, like West Berlin or Brasilia at the present time.
Londinium, crowded with merchants and provisions.
Rufus, son of Callicinus, greetings to Epilicus and all his fellows. I believe you know very well. If you have made the list, please send it. Do look after everything carefully and see that you turn the slave girl into cash.
Which money by the terms likewise of the claim shall be paid to me by crescents or by the person concerned.
We don't have many of their written words, but we've got hundreds and hundreds of their names carved on inscriptions.
Clementinus made this box tile.
To the god who first thought of roads and paths.
May he who carried off Bilbia from me become as liquid as the waters.
A little piece of lead from Bath with some writing on it. And here was a person lost his girlfriend. And he wrote this backwards so that only the gods could understand, and he would have thrown it into the spring and thought, well, I've done now all I can do.
May he who carried off Bilbia from me become as liquid as the waters.
It seems to have been really almost a common Celtic belief that you could curse and destroy a person by turning them into a pool of liquid water.
I wish myself a happy new year.
Priscus, son of Tusius, stonemason, a tribesman from the Chartres region, willingly and deservedly fulfilled his vow to the goddess Julis.
Astralis has been wandering off on his own every day for the last fortnight.
Titus Agnesius Tyrannus is hereby solemnly cursed. So is Publius Caesarius Felix.
To the spirits of the departed Flavius Helius, a Greek by race, lived 40 years. Flavia Ingenua set this up to her husband.
To the spirits of the departed, Mercatilla, freedwoman and foster daughter of Magnius, lived 1 year, 6 months, 12 days.
Marcus Coxius Firmus pays his respects to the genie of the land of Britain.
S P Q R.
Let's just imagine someone who was born in about 350. He would have been 17 when the great catastrophe happened. The great catastrophe was the barbarian conspiracy. Picts, Scots, and Attocotti, these nasty people who lived in the Outer Hebrides, 8 people, made a concerted attack on Britain. Hadrian's Wall, then fully policed, was overrun.
The barbarians attacked everywhere with all their power and brought the inhabitants of Britain to the point of revolting from Roman rule and living on their own, no longer obedient to Roman laws.
Now, the might of Rome had crumbled. Britain was in a state of chaos, south as far as the Thames. This was a very complicated chaos. It was not just Picts and Scots, but the army was in a state of discontent. Morale was breaking down, and soldiers broke away from the established routine and joined the discontents. There were also the vast numbers of dropouts, which there must have been in British society at this time. There were all the discontents in the towns as well, people just scraping a living. It was a very complicated society, so that our man of 17 in 367 would have seen this suddenly crumble. And then throughout his 20s, 30s and 40s, he would have seen a new thing happen.
A council was called to settle what was best and most expedient to be done, in order to repel such frequent and fatal eruptions and plunderings. Then all the councillors were so blinded that, as a protection to their country, they sealed its doom by inviting among them the fierce and impious Saxons, a race hateful both to God and men, to repel the invasions of the northern nations. They first landed on the eastern side of the island by the invitation of the unlucky king, and there fixed their sharp talons, apparently to fight in favor of the island, but, alas, more truly against it.
By 410, by the time our man is 60, he's up against a situation which he was totally unable to contend with. Things were happening very, very rapidly, drastically.
They industriously aggravate each occasion of quarrel, saying that they will break the treaty and plunder the whole island. In a short time they follow up their threats with deeds, for the fire of vengeance spread from sea to sea and did not cease, until it reached the other side of the island and dipped its red and savage tongue in the Western Ocean.
So that this system, the time-honored system of using mercenaries, had broken down, and Britain succumbed because of it. And eventually, of course, the Saxons brought in their brothers and their cousins and their aunts, and the great flood of Saxon immigration followed.
Marcus Coxius Firmus pays his respects to the genie of the land of Britain.
Gone were the soldiers. and the sailors. The roads were covered with filth and rubbish, animal bones lying about, puddles in the roads, gravel, old tiles from the roofs thrown into the puddles. But along the roads were huts of a totally different sort, huts built by the Germanic mercenaries. And this is the end of Roman might, rectangularity and order.
To the spirits of the departed, Coelia Octata, age 13, you mysterious spirits who dwell in Pluto's Acherusian realms, and whom the meager ashes and the shade, empty semblance of the body, seek following the brief light of life. Sire of an innocent daughter, I, a pitiable victim of unfair hope, bewail her final end. Quintus Corellius Fortis, her father, had this set up.
Wondrous is this masonry, shattered by the fates. The fortifications have given way, the buildings raised by giants are crumbling. The roofs have collapsed, the towers are in ruins. There is rime on the mortar. The walls are rent and broken away, and have fallen undermined by age. The owners and builders have perished and gone, and have been held fast in the earth's embrace, the ruthless clutch of the grave, while 100 generations of mankind have passed away. Red of hue and hoary with lichen, this wall has outlasted kingdom after kingdom, standing unmoved by storms. The lofty arch has fallen, and so these courts lie desolate.
What we call the beginning is often the end. And to make an end is to make a beginning. The end is where we start from.
Down there, in those blue-green depths, there are 55 million people.
Held fast in the earth's embrace.
Green land, red bricks. The readers were Anthony Hall, Trevor Martin, and Nigel Lambert. The commentary was by Barry Cunliffe, Giacchetto Hawkes, Anne Ross, and Michael Drake. The producer for the Voices of the People was Charles Parker. Special music, sound composition, and orchestration were by David Kane, assisted by Norman MacLeod. The series was created by Michael Mason in the BBC Radiophonic Workshop.